What if your greatest strength became the reason you were fired? This is the story of a humble intern who dared to challenge a powerful lawyer. And what happened next will leave you speechless. Stay tuned for a tale of justice and redemption like no other.
The morning sun was already beginning to warm the streets of Chicago as Daniel hurried toward the towering downtown office building. His suit, though impeccably clean, was modest compared to the designer outfits he knew his coworkers would wear. The law firm Henderson and Associates was renowned for handling high-profile cases, a world far removed from the working-class neighborhood where Daniel had grown up. From his first day as an intern, Daniel knew he had an uphill battle ahead. His responsibilities were basic: making copies, filing paperwork, and fetching coffee. Despite this, he approached every task with enthusiasm. He saw this internship as a stepping stone to his dream of becoming a successful lawyer. Inside the conference room, Matthew Henderson, the firm's lead attorney, was briefing the team with his characteristic confidence. Dressed in a tailored suit and exuding authority, Matthew was a man who thrived under pressure and had built a reputation for winning even the most challenging cases. "This case is critical," Matthew announced, dropping a thick file onto the glass conference table. "If we lose, it won't just cost us a client. It could tarnish this firm's reputation." Standing quietly in the corner, Daniel listened intently, taking notes despite not being officially invited to the meeting. The case involved a complex corporate dispute between two multinational companies, and Matthew was laying out a strategy that seemed strong but had gaps Daniel couldn't help but notice. That evening, as he organized documents related to the case, Daniel spotted a key inconsistency in the contracts submitted by the opposing party. Though he wasn't a licensed attorney yet, his law school training and natural analytical skills told him this detail could turn the case around. Heart racing, he debated whether to share his discovery. The next morning, he mustered his courage and waited outside Matthew's office, the documents in hand. "What do you need, Daniel?" Matthew asked impatiently, glancing up from his desk. Daniel explained his finding calmly, outlining how the inconsistency could undermine the opposition's argument. Matthew's eyes narrowed as he listened, clearly evaluating the young intern. "All right," he said after a pause. "We'll mention it at the client meeting. But if this doesn't pan out, you'll regret wasting my time." The tension in the conference room was palpable the next day. Henderson and Associates' most important client, influential businessman Henry Sullivan, sat at the head of the table, visibly unimpressed by the initial strategy Matthew had outlined. "This isn't enough," Henry interrupted, shaking his head. "If we don't find a stronger angle, I'm pulling the plug on this." Matthew hesitated, a rare flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Just then, Daniel, defying every unwritten rule of office hierarchy, raised his hand. "Mr. Sullivan, if I may, I believe I've identified something that could significantly strengthen our position," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the weight of every gaze turning toward him. The room fell silent as Matthew shot him a sharp look, but Daniel pressed on. He explained his analysis with clarity, demonstrating how the inconsistency in the opposing contracts could dismantle their case. Henry, far from being annoyed, seemed intrigued. "That's an excellent observation," Henry said after a moment. "What's your name?" "Daniel Miller, sir." Though visibly reluctant, Matthew agreed to incorporate Daniel's findings into their strategy. Over the next few weeks, the firm worked tirelessly, refining their arguments around the key point Daniel had uncovered. On the day of the trial, Henderson and Associates presented a case so airtight that the opposing counsel struggled to respond. When the judge ruled in favor of Henry Sullivan's company, the courtroom erupted in applause. Henry approached Daniel directly, shaking his hand firmly. "You've got an incredible mind, young man. I hope we'll have the chance to work together again." though Daniel felt a swell of pride. He couldn't ignore Matthew's cold glare from across the room. Instead of congratulating him, Matthew simply patted him on the shoulder before walking away. That evening, as Daniel walked home through the busy streets of Chicago, he reflected on the day's events. He had taken a significant step forward in his career, but at what cost? Had he gained a mentor or made a powerful enemy? The office buzzed with excitement the day after the trial. Attorneys and paralegals exchanged compliments about how the firm had managed to win such a difficult case. Yet, amidst the celebrations, Daniel felt a growing unease. While his contributions had been critical to the victory, his name hadn't been mentioned once. Later that morning, Matthew called for an all-hands meeting in the main conference room. Daniel attended, expecting to hear some acknowledgement of his role. Instead, Matthew delivered a polished speech, attributing the success entirely to his leadership and expertise. This victory reminds us why Henderson and Associates remains at the top in Chicago, Matthew declared, his voice dripping with self-assurance. Under my direction, we continue to achieve exceptional results. Daniel sat quietly, a knot tightening in his stomach. Was this the norm in the professional world? He had poured his heart into this case, yet his work had been buried under someone else's glory. That evening, unable to let it go, he decided to confront Matthew directly. Waiting until most of the staff had gone home, Daniel approached Matthew's office. The senior attorney looked up from his desk, visibly annoyed at the interruption. "What is it now, Daniel?" Matthew asked, his tone sharp. "Sir, I want to talk about my role in the Sullivan case," Daniel said, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. "I believe my contributions were significant, and I deserve some recognition." Matthew leaned back in his chair, chuckling dryly. "Recognition?" he scoffed. "Let me tell you something, Daniel. You're an intern. Your job is to follow orders, not to expect applause." "With all due respect, sir," Daniel replied firmly, "the strategy that won us the case was my idea." Matthew's expression darkened. He stood, towering over Daniel. "That's the problem with you," he said coldly. "You think talent alone is enough to break the hierarchy. Let me remind you, this is my firm, and I decide who gets credit. You're fired." Daniel felt the words hit him like a punch. Gathering his belongings in silence, he avoided the curious stares of the few remaining staff. As he stepped into the cool Chicago night, he felt a mix of anger and relief. Perhaps this was the push he needed to find a place where his skills would truly be valued. The days following his dismissal were some of the hardest Daniel had faced. He spent hours sending out resumes and making calls, but nothing seemed to stick. The legal field in Chicago was competitive, and without glowing references, opportunities were scarce. One afternoon, while walking through a bustling neighborhood near Lake Michigan, his phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. "Hello." Daniel answered hesitantly. "Daniel Miller," came a familiar voice. "This is Henry Sullivan." Daniel nearly stopped in his tracks. He couldn't imagine why someone as important as Sullivan would be calling him. "I heard what happened at Henderson and Associates," Sullivan continued. "It's a shame, but maybe it's a blessing in disguise. I have a proposition for you." Curiosity piqued. Daniel agreed to meet Sullivan at a nearby cafe the next morning. When they sat down, Sullivan explained his vision. "For years, I've wanted to make a difference beyond the corporate world," Sullivan said. "I started a nonprofit organization to provide legal aid to underserved communities, but it hasn't taken off the way I hoped. I think you're the person to change that." Daniel listened, his mind racing. Leading a nonprofit wasn't something he'd ever considered, but the idea of using his skills to help people resonated deeply with him. "What exactly would you need me to do?" Daniel asked. "Take charge," Sullivan said, leaning forward. "Run the organization. Build a team. Bring justice to people who've been ignored for too long." After a moment of reflection, Daniel nodded. "I'm in." His first assignment came quickly. Sullivan took him to a neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, where families were facing eviction due to fraudulent practices by their landlord. Daniel spent hours listening to their stories, noting the desperation and resilience in their voices. That evening, as he reviewed case files in the modest office Sullivan had provided, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: purpose. His dismissal from Henderson and Associates no longer felt like a setback. It was the beginning of something far more meaningful. The weeks following Daniel's new role were some of the most fulfilling of his life. The nonprofit, now under his leadership, began making waves in Chicago's underserved communities. Each case brought hope to families who had long been ignored by the legal system. However, amidst this positive momentum, an unexpected call jolted him back to his past. Daniel was poring over case files one morning when his phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed the name of one of his former colleagues at Henderson and Associates. "Daniel, have you seen the news?" the voice asked, sounding tense. "No." "What's going on?" Daniel replied, his curiosity piqued. "It's Matthew Henderson. He's in big trouble. The Chicago Tribune just published an expose accusing him of evidence tampering in one of his high-profile cases. They're launching a full investigation, and it doesn't look good." Daniel fell silent for a moment, processing the information. While he couldn't say he was surprised, hearing that Matthew's cutthroat tactics had caught up with him was unsettling. That afternoon, Daniel received an email that he hadn't expected. It was from Matthew, requesting a meeting. Part of him wanted to ignore it, but his curiosity and a lingering sense of professional obligation drove him to agree. They met in a quiet cafe on the edge of the city. Matthew looked like a shadow of his former self. His usual polished appearance was gone, replaced by a disheveled suit and weary eyes. "Daniel, I need your help," Matthew said, his voice lacking its usual bravado. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You fired me when I tried to help you before. Why should I help you now?" Matthew sighed deeply, avoiding Daniel's gaze. "I made mistakes," he admitted. "I was arrogant and reckless. But you're the only person I know who has the skills and integrity to help me out of this." Daniel stared at him, conflicted. While he felt no obligation to help the man who had dismissed him so coldly, he couldn't ignore the potential impact of the scandal on the firm's clients and employees. "If I agree to help," Daniel said finally, "there are conditions. You'll have to be completely honest about everything, and you'll need to commit to handling this ethically. No shortcuts, no lies." Matthew nodded, desperation etched on his face. "Agreed." Daniel and Matthew's collaboration began cautiously. Despite their agreement, the tension between them was undeniable. Matthew, once so commanding, now found himself deferring to Daniel's guidance, a dynamic that neither could have imagined just months earlier. The accusations against Matthew were serious. Evidence tampering, withholding information, and other unethical practices were all on the table. To build a defense, Daniel immersed himself in reviewing case files and court records. What he found didn't entirely exonerate Matthew. In a late-night meeting in Daniel's office, the truth finally came to light. "Matthew," Daniel said, laying a stack of documents on the desk, "not all of these accusations are baseless. Some of the mistakes you made weren't accidents." Matthew leaned forward, his head in his hands. "I know," he admitted quietly. "There were moments when I felt cornered, and I made choices I'm not proud of. But I didn't think they'd ever come back to haunt me like this." Daniel exhaled deeply, his disappointment evident. "If you want any chance of salvaging your career, you need to take full responsibility for your actions. There's no room for denial or excuses anymore." Matthew nodded, his tone subdued. "I'll do whatever it takes." As the case unfolded, Daniel crafted a strategy, to address the accusations. He aimed to highlight the systemic pressures in the legal field that often pushed attorneys toward ethically gray decisions, while emphasizing Matthew's willingness to reform. Meanwhile, Matthew began to change. He attended community outreach events organized by Daniel's nonprofit, witnessing firsthand the power of ethical legal work. Slowly, his hardened exterior gave way to a more reflective and humble demeanor. The day of the disciplinary hearing arrived. Daniel stood by Matthew as his advocate, presenting a compelling case that balanced accountability with a vision for reform. He argued that while Matthew's past decisions were flawed, his recent actions demonstrated a sincere commitment to change. The hearing concluded with a mixed but hopeful outcome. Matthew retained his license, but was placed under probation with strict oversight. For him, the experience was both humbling and transformative. After the hearing, Matthew turned to Daniel. "I owe you more than I can say, not just for saving my career, but for showing me a better way to practice law." Daniel smiled faintly. "This isn't just about saving your career, Matthew. It's about making the legal system better for everyone. Now let's make sure we do something meaningful with this second chance." The two men, once adversaries, now shared a common mission: to reform the justice system and ensure that integrity, not ambition, would guide their work. Months after the disciplinary hearing, Matthew and Daniel's partnership began to reshape the legal landscape in Chicago. Together, they launched a series of free legal workshops in underprivileged neighborhoods, teaching residents about their rights and offering pro bono representation. For Daniel, this work was deeply personal. He knew what it felt like to grow up in a community where legal resources were scarce. Seeing families reclaim their homes or fight against systemic injustices reaffirmed his belief that the law could be a force for good. One of their most impactful cases involved a group of factory workers who had been underpaid and overworked by a prominent local company. For years, the workers had been afraid to come forward, fearing retaliation. When they finally sought help from Daniel's nonprofit, he and Matthew jumped into action. As they prepared the case, Matthew proved he had truly turned a corner. He worked tirelessly, ensuring every piece of evidence was airtight and every argument bulletproof. His former arrogance was replaced with determination and humility. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed with community members and media. Daniel took the lead in presenting the case, outlining how the company had violated labor laws and exploited its employees. Matthew's role was equally critical, delivering a closing argument that was both passionate and persuasive. When the judge ruled in favor of the workers, awarding them compensation and mandating reforms within the company, the room erupted in cheers. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Daniel and Matthew for comments. A journalist asked Matthew directly, "What inspired such a dramatic change in your approach to the law?" Matthew glanced at Daniel before replying. "Someone once reminded me that the law isn't just about winning. It's about doing what's right. That lesson has changed everything for me." Daniel, though surprised by the public acknowledgement, felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This victory wasn't just about one case. It was a symbol of what they could achieve together. On a crisp fall morning, Daniel found himself walking through the streets of the South Side, where their legal aid workshops had started. The neighborhood was slowly transforming, with new initiatives bringing hope and opportunity. As he approached the nonprofit's office, he saw volunteers and staff bustling with energy. The waiting area was filled with people seeking help, and the team was working tirelessly to ensure no one was turned away. Hearing footsteps behind him, Daniel turned to see Henry Sullivan approaching, a warm smile on his face. "You've done incredible work here, Daniel," Henry said, shaking his hand firmly. "This organization is becoming something truly remarkable." "Thank you, Henry," Daniel replied. "But it's not just me. It's everyone who believed in this mission, including you." Later that day, Matthew arrived for their weekly strategy meeting. While he still carried some of his old intensity, Daniel noticed how much more collaborative and open he had become. "We've got another case lined up," Matthew said, sliding a file across the table. "It's big, and it's going to need both of us." Daniel smiled as he picked up the folder. "Sounds like we've got work to do." As the sun set over the city, Daniel reflected on how far he had come. From a struggling intern dismissed for challenging authority to a leader transforming lives, his journey had been anything but easy. Yet every challenge had brought him closer to the man he was meant to be. He thought back to the words he had once said to Matthew. "Justice isn't just an ideal, it's a responsibility." Those words had guided him through every obstacle, and they would continue to guide him as he and his team fought for a better future. Walking back into the office, Daniel felt a deep sense of purpose. The path ahead was still full of challenges, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. With a renewed commitment to justice, he was ready to take on whatever came next.
And this brings us to the end of today's story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give us a thumbs up and share it with someone who might also be touched or inspired by this narrative. I love reading your comments. Each message is a gift and a true motivation for us to keep bringing you stories that touch the heart and help us grow as individuals. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure to do so and activate the notification bell to never miss any of our upcoming stories. That way, you'll always stay connected to the reflections and messages we prepare with so much care. Thank you so much for being with us. See you in the next story, and may God bless you.